Hello and welcome to Bangalore International Centre's very own podcast, BIC Talks. Bangalore International Centre is a platform for informed conversations, exchange of ideas, and a space for arts and culture. BIC Talks brings the essence of all that the physical space stands for and more to your doorstep.
South Asia, home to a fourth of the world's population, home to hundreds of thousands of cultures, numerous nation-states and diverse landscapes, and along with them, numerous musical traditions. Hi, I'm Pawan Srinath and welcome to BIC Talks. On this episode, we begin to answer the question, can a South Asian identity be expressed through music? This episode of BIC Talks is an edited version of the first half of a live YouTube event from December 2020 by the South Asian Symphony Foundation. The foundation's co-founder, Ambassador Nirupama Menon Rao, spoke to 5 artists from across the region to explore answers to the question. Pakistani musician and writer Ali Sethi from New York and South Indian musician, writer and activist TM Krishna share their thoughts on this episode. On another note, the South Asian Symphony Orchestra's Nivanthi Karunaratne will be representing the orchestra in the Hope and Harmony Ensemble formed by the Washington-based classical movements for the US presidential inauguration on the 20th of January 2021. With that, over to Ambassador Rao.
Music, it has been said, has a direct line to the deepest part of what we are. That is, a way to make sense of the world. The musician is an integrating figure. He or she can offer us the dream of finding peaceful coexistence among warring factions. That is probably a felt need for us, particularly in our region, this subcontinental space rimmed by the Hindu Kush and the Himalaya and stretching almost 2,000 miles to the waters of the Indian Ocean, the geography we call South Asia. How do we rise above differences and disputes to create a practical utopia, you may call it a utopia, built through music? How are we to extract venom and disarm the ideologies of conflict? Do we understand the duties of freedom, of peace, hope, and integration? One recalls Beethoven, who in his great heart embraced all mankind with piercing insight that permeated all falsehood, to seek truth, never to betray truth, as he once said, in the manner of a wizard controlling the demons he had invoked. The historian Simon Sharma recently said that the world has built a romance around division. In fact, in South Asia, we have tended to do more than that. We have built divisiveness that destroys any visions of unity we may have. And as one of our panelists, Ali Sethi, told me a few months ago, we have become fixated on difference. So how do we make sense of our identities today? Can our identities as Indians or Pakistanis, Afghans or Sri Lankans, Nepalese, Bangladeshis or Maldivians be expressed through a conjoined expression of the fact that we are all South Asians, Homo sapiens of the subcontinental variety, whether from east or west of the region, north or south? Can we craft a cosmopolitan, less divergent view of ourselves to see the continuities and the connections, creating a dialogue across difference, in other words? Can music be a code breaker? Can music provide that safe space where we are just human again, conversing, sharing the simple gifts of coexistence? Mr. Krishna, I turn the floor over to you to make your remarks.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Rao. Thank you all for giving me this opportunity to have this conversation, and a very important conversation that we are having about a South Asian identity, a South Asian musical identity, and probably a South Asian cultural identity at some level. The first question that comes to my mind is the creation of identities themselves. How are these identities created? I mean, is there a fundamental framework which is the basis to identities being created? So let's maybe look at it. I think enormously the word culture keeps coming back. What is this idea of culture? And the beauty about culture and about most beautiful things is that we know it, we feel it, we can smell it, we can taste it, we can even hear it, and we see it, but we actually don't know what it is. So when we say our culture or shared culture, it's an emotion, actually. And that's what binds you. So is there a South Asian identity? My instinctive answer is yes. But if you exactly ask me, can you tell me what it is exactly? I may not be able to articulate it in a fashion that is a closed box, that encompasses the entire spectrum of things. Because I think it is in the color, it's in the design, it is in the melody, it is in the lack of melody, maybe too. It is in being in rhythm, being offbeat. There is the shared sense of movement, the shared sense of how we respond culturally in South Asia, musically and through art, that binds us. And I think one important aspect, and when I say this, I'm not in any way undermining any other region of the world, is that this region has definitely been welcoming to so much of sound, so many sounds beyond this region. I think that's a very important aspect of what we should call culture, is the fluidity and the welcomeness of receiving. If you look at any art form that we sing or that we may call within quotes traditional for whatever reason, or modern, whatever word you want to use, contemporary, all these words actually have very little meaning in my dictionary. But nevertheless, all these have been through parallel, through traditional, through receivings that have come from so many different cultures across the globe. And there's been no nitpicking of it. It has seamlessly come into the sounds. If you look at Indian ragas, for example, I mean, you could trace these ragas to beyond South Asia. You could go all the way to Iran. The connection between Maqam music and the music in India, the connection between the rhythms of Africa and the rhythms of India, the literature, the theorization in India and Greek theorization in ancient music. So I think in a most incredible manner, the South Asian identity does not just belong to the countries that represent South Asia. It actually belongs to this larger spectrum of the world, because we've received so much and we've given and we allowed for giving and receiving in a manner that's quite incredibly beautiful. So I think the South Asian identity is for me an identity of fluidity. And it has nothing to do with the political borders that we've created. And culture has nothing to do with political borders. Political borders are just state prisms. That's all they are. You know, there's a lovely song written by a Tamil poet where he asks, is the wind ever stopped to travel between countries by fences? Does the tree that grows in one side of a border not have its roots on the other side of the border? I think that is actually what the South Asian identity is. That you could trace it to all these regions, and you could trace the melodies and the rhythms to all these regions. So can we have a South Asian identity? I definitely think we can, but I just want to say that itself is not one identity. There's a multiplicity of South Asian identities. So when we discuss a South Asian identity, let's also say we're discussing South Asian identities in plural, because you could have so many different ideas of South Asian identities. And here, I think we also need to be very careful, because there is also the possibility of every one of these identities becoming monoliths by themselves, becoming the dominant cultures by themselves. I mean, look at Indian music. In most popular conversation, we are going to be talking about, within quotes, the so-called classical world or Bollywood. That's deeply problematic. So when we say Indian musical identity, we have to say identities. So what are we talking about? We are talking about those that are forgotten to, those that are not heard, those that are appropriated. The names that are lost and the tunes that are lost and the melodies that are lost and the rhythms that are not spoken about are part of this narrative. I think we need to explore the possibility that we are looking at multiplicity even in these identities. Because if we don't, we fall into another trap of creating one monolithic notion of South Asia. And that's the last thing we do. We need to do, I think, in a world where especially in today's world where everybody seems to obsess with creating fences and creating some kind of monoliths. So one important aspect of a South Asian identity is allowing for the contestation of the identity itself, allowing for a questioning of that notion itself from within, from ourselves. So once you do that, then it automatically brings into conversation multiple religions, multiple castes, multiple sources, and the vibrancy of that. What happens, great art happens in that state of flux, and flux is such a beautiful state. And I think that flux is created when there are multiple narratives coming into that flux and asking questions. So when we seek the idea of peace, the idea of peace cannot be sought in some clean slate of happiness. I think the idea of peace is sought in the democraticness of equality, empathy, equity, and creating a level playing field for all these multiple sounds to ask questions and pose different ways of coming together. Because I think that's where it is. Because we can speak technically about the melodies that bind us, or the rhythms that bind us, or the literature that binds us. But I think beyond that, fundamentally, it is, I think, creating this space that will bring us together, creating this environment that will bring us together. And I think in this, there is a great role of artists, of spaces, of people, of how do we create even institutions, because I think we also have to think about how do we create institutions that have this vibrancy, that have this possibility and are open to questioning, because the South Asian identity must be an identity that is open to melodic, to rhythmic, to literature, to poetic questioning of itself. And then I think we have something magical truly happening that traverses all the differences that we have. Instead of saying celebrating the differences, I would say let the differences play out in a sense of celebration. And I think then we have something special happening here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So eloquently put, and you raised several, I think, very tantalizing, thought-provoking questions, particularly about the multiplicities of South Asian identities, together cohering into an idea of South Asian identities, and allowing these differences to play out and to create a sense of celebration out of that, as they say in Sanskrit, that krida, as it were, that play of these different identities. And also I was very drawn to what you mentioned about the role of artists and how we are going to be able to create institutions that are able to generate a sense of equality, empathy, coming together, creating that space of togetherness. So these were all issues I think that we can discuss further. I also like that point you mentioned, that culture has nothing to do with fluidity, because there is a certain, organic flow. We call it the chakras in India. That sense, that chakras between borders, as it were, is the wind stopping the trees from blowing? Is the wind being stopped by borders from blowing? Or trees on one side have roots on the other? I love those images. But let me stop here, and I'm going to ask Ali Sethi to offer his remarks.
Thank you, Ambassador Rao. I think I would like to kind of address our many themes today by telling the story of my journey in music. I grew up in Lahore in Pakistan, listening to what now is clear to me was a wide variety of musical genres. I grew up listening to Qawwali. I grew up listening to Ghazal. I grew up listening to, the religious, more sort of ritual affiliated genres of Soz Khani, which would happen in the holy month of Muharram. My mother's family is Shia, and they are, old walled city sort of patrons of the rituals of bringing out the horse, the Zuljana and the Matam, etc. And I would hear and pitch my voice to these sort of very Indic, in some ways, renditions and reenactments of the carnage at Karbala. I grew up listening also to a lot of pop music, we had Channel V, and so we would access Colonial Cousins, and because of Channel V and because of Indian movies, etc., we had access to what I now realize was the larger subcontinental musical, poetic, lyrical tradition. When I started studying music formally, I sang through school and sort of did it kind of as a kind of passion, and then became formally apprenticed to an Ustad Nasiruddin Sami of the Delhi Gharana. I had just finished my liberal arts education, just wrapped up my 4 years at college in America, and had been singing many of these things without really knowing or without being able to say in any theoretical way, to be able to formulate what they were, how they worked. And I think when I sat down with my Ustad, I had this, what now seems to be a kind of arrogant idea about what learning or studying music might be. I was thinking of it very much inside the paradigm of knowledge production or knowledge absorption, appropriation, and then reproduction. This idea that you study something, you schematize it, you put it inside a framework, and then you are able to work with that. And what I learned very quickly was that not only were the sort of provenances of these ragas and these tals and these concepts of ras and bhav and of the microtone and of the ang of the raga and of the shakhsiyat, the personality of the raga and of the timing of the raga, not only were they wildly subjective, but also they were coming from often very different places. They were not all, shall we say, made in the same laboratory. They were not made with the same tools. They were not all coming from the same sensibility. And that the practitioners of this music, the great practitioners of this music, as I learned, were very comfortable with this idea that, you could have a raga like Nat Narayani, for example, which is made up of Narayani, which comes to us from a Carnatic musical tradition, and Nat, which is the music of the Nat performing communities. And you could see how, in these hybrid, sort of seemingly unstable amalgams, musicians would kind of morph and reconcile and then part ways. And then within a single raga, within a single bandish, you could see different worlds, different castes, different, sensibilities residing without necessarily having to surrender their respective autonomies. That became a kind of recurring theme for me, this idea that a Qawwali can kind of go into a bhajan space and then go into a Baghdadi zikr space and then come back into this space of 3s and 4s and 5s and 6s, and the tals can change, and the rag can exit. You can exit the Khamaj space and go into a Bheen space and come back into the... And so the effect, the cumulative effect, as I think TM Krishna kind of pointed out earlier, you can really only articulate it as an emotional experience. You can really only grasp it as an emotional experience. I think codification, schematization, any kind of attempt to control these artistic strategies and to kind of put them into a sort of notational framework was impossible. And I learned soon enough to surrender that desire. And the moment I surrendered that, the moment I let go of this need to control this knowledge, as it were, I think I suddenly began to receive it. I began to dwell in it. In seemingly minor practices, I would discover whole worlds of formerly unknown sort of musical practice. For example, my other teacher, Farida Khanum, with whom I have practiced ghazal and thumri singing and some bandish work. There's this wonderful technique of singing ghazal, which, as we know, comes to us from Arabia via Persia, and then really it pretty much vanishes in Arabia. It is not the main sort of genre in Persia, but it remains this kind of very popular genre of music in South Asia, in Afghanistan and in Pakistan and India and Bengal and beyond. There's this wonderful musical strategy that Farida ji has, which is of singing in an R, sort of singing askance, askew, as a kind of, you have a dadra beat, which is apparently, 3 and 6. And yet sometimes you'll hear her singing a phrase in a 7, or you'll hear her singing a phrase in an 8 or in a 10. I mean, if you sit down to count it, it seems kind of extra mathematical. But actually what she's doing is, it's a kind of poetic sensibility, which is to elongate, to shorten, to truncate at will, but to do it as we say in Hindi, Urdu, we say dhang se karna, to do it well is the point. So to grow comfortable with a kind of improvisational attitude, to grow comfortable with this kind of almost algorithmic music, which is at once guidelined and free, which is at once conforming to something, but also departing from it at all times. To learn to live inside these paradoxes without encountering them as contradictions, as things that need to be held apart, became for me an alternative and a kind of tonic healing alternative to the political, social world that we live in, especially in South Asia today, where in Pakistan, in India, in Afghanistan, we face a lot of political, religious violence. We have people obsessing over everything from trying to have linear, tidy genealogies and narratives about where we come from, and in the process completely falsifying and doing a real violence to our very supple histories. And yet, through music, which happily continues to be a connecting force, even in this era where people like myself, I can't go to India, visas are not granted, I'm not allowed, people like me are not allowed to work with any Indian institution. We constantly hear this behind the scenes, oh, we love you here, we would love to have you working with this entity or with this platform, etc. But we can't officially claim it because there's a lot of pressure, etc. And one is familiar, of course, with this because one is from Pakistan, where in the past one has grown up with so much of this kind of excluding of the other and this policing and patrolling of national boundary and national interest. And yet through music, on a simple Instagram live session or on a YouTube live session, just kind of making a little trail, starting with a ghazal and showing how it connects to a Muhammad Rafi song from, the 1950s, connecting it back to a thumri from, the 19th century, then going back into a bhajan. And it kind of sets up this alternative universe in which everybody feels welcome, in which everybody can participate, which allows us to simultaneously, it's like levitating above these, otherwise these kind of morbid, marshy realities that pull us down every day, back into our narrow, toxic little pools of despair. Through music and through lyric, I find, so I think I've grown accustomed to kind of working this alternative magic, but not only for other people, but for myself as a way of reminding myself. And now as somebody who lives in New York City, where again, inside the liberal American paradigm, identity is very much a pressing thing. And to be brown is to be inside this, there's black, there's white, there's brown. And then this kind of, again, this music allows me to really resist any monolithic definition of what it means to be in the world. And I find that South Asian music is really that soul space that lets me and many others, whether it's me just humming to myself on a train, or whether it's me listening to South Asian music, or whether it's that kind of extraordinary congregation-like mahal atmosphere that is created in a mehfil, in a concert, in a sima. We are here and there and one and many, and fundamentally comfortable with those paradoxes, which I think is the quintessential South Asian attitude or sensibility, to be comfortable with paradox, to not have to experience it as a contradiction, to not have to pry it apart and say, this belongs here and this belongs there, and yes, they can come together, and still to see it as constituent units. No, we are not those people, and we don't need to be those people. And I think this, for me, is the great South Asian strategy for survival, if you will.
Thank you, Ali. And I think you also, in a sense, seem to reaffirm what Mr. Krishna mentioned about the sense of hybridness that defines our identities in South Asia. This is an amalgam, but we're not being surrounded by our respective autonomies, as you said. So there is that emotional experience, that concept of surrender, and very subtle in the histories of the arts and cultures that we seek to uphold, and the sense of levitation. I love that concept of levitation. It seems to be realistically achievable in what we do in music and being comfortable with paradoxes, with contradictions. And I'm reminded of what one of your professors at Harvard, Ali Asani, wrote about in his PhD thesis. It was a thesis about the Ginans of Gujarat, and the word is based on the Sanskrit jnana, or knowledge and awareness. And the title is the Bhuj Niranjan. Bhuj is in Gujarat, and the Bhuj Niranjan. It's such a Sanskrit-sounding, Indic-sounding word, but it's essentially a collection of sacred poetry and bhajans that are used by the Khwaja Ismailis. And you have poems where Imam Ali, for instance, is called Na Kalanki, which means blemishless. And this quality of blemishlessness is also what we use to describe many Hindu deities in India. For instance, with the avatars of Vishnu, for instance, we refer to many of the avatars of Vishnu as the blemishless ones. So in a sense, the people of the subcontinent really embrace these things in a very borderless way. And it's this concept of borderlessness, I think, where ultimately this concept of South Asian identity would reside.
Thank you so much for tuning in and listening till the end of our edited conversation. In this episode, we only managed to share the thoughts expressed by musicians TM Krishna and Ali Sethi. Head on over to South Asian Symphony Foundation's YouTube channel to watch and listen to the full discussion featuring 5 artists from around South Asia. Thank you for listening in till the end. Please share this episode with a friend on social media, WhatsApp, or anywhere else. It would mean the world to us. And in case you're listening via iTunes or Apple Podcasts, please leave us a rating and a review. Subscribe to BIC Talks on email or your favorite podcast app and don't miss out on future episodes. This episode of BIC Talks has Gaurav Krishna as our sound engineer with support from S. Sarvanaraj and Lekha Naidu. And the accompanying episode artwork was made by Chandni Venkataraman.
Thank you for listening to this episode of BIC Talks. This podcast can be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org, as well as on any of your favorite podcast platforms. Tune in for new episodes every week, and do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram pages to stay informed on our latest updates.